The keeper stirs on his cot, the rustle of his straw-filled mattress reaching you before he himself moves into view. He sits up slowly and draws a heavy woolen coat over his shoulders, his movements unhurried and shaped by the cold that has settled into the hut overnight. You watch him cross to the hearth and kneel on the flagstone there, reaching for a bundle of dry twigs tied with a wisp of hemp. He lays 3 twigs across the grey mound of yesterday's embers, then places a block of peat beside them, its dark surface rough as bark. With a piece of flint and a steel he strikes a spark into a small nest of charred cloth, and a tiny orange glow gathers itself into a flame that catches the twigs and begins to gnaw at the peat with a low, contented crackle. The light from the newborn fire gilds the keeper's face, showing you the lines around his eyes and the calm, unexpectant expression of a man for whom each morning is much the same as the one before it. He rises and takes the tin kettle from the shelf, then steps outside through the low door that he leaves ajar, allowing a curl of cooler air to slip into the room and stir the smoke near the rafters. You follow, or imagine you follow, and find yourself at the threshold, looking out. The hut sits on the near bank of the River Wye, pressed against the foot of a gentle green slope, and the wooden toll bridge stretches away from you across the water in a series of dark, weathered timbers supported by stone piers. Everything is wet with dew, the planks of the bridge shine faintly, the toll bar load across the near end is studded with droplets, and the rope that holds a small rowing boat beneath the bridge hangs heavy and dark with moisture. The river itself runs broad and quiet, sliding past the piers with a sound that is less a noise and more a long, steady exhale, continuous and unbroken, and the mist that rises from its surface coils upward in slow, weightless ribbons that blur the far bank into a soft wash of grey-green. The keeper walks a few paces to the river's edge, where a flat stone step forms a natural landing, and he dips the kettle into the water, the metal mouth filling with a deep glug that is swallowed almost at once by the hush of the current. He straightens, pauses to look upstream and then downstream, and his gaze holds nothing more urgent than the drift of a fallen leaf turning slowly in an eddy. You notice that nothing moves on the far bank, except a single crow, black against the damp grass, picking with mechanical patience at something half buried in the mud. The bird does not call. It simply works its beak into the earth, pauses and works again, a small dark shape in a landscape that otherwise seems suspended between night and morning. Back inside the hut, the keeper hangs the kettle over the fire from an iron hook, adjusting its height so that the flame licks the bottom without reaching the rim. He then takes a handful of dried tea leaves from a pottery jar and drops them into a brown earthenware cup, the leaves rustling dryly before settling into a heap at the bottom. While the water slowly begins to murmur toward a boil, he stands near the window and watches the mist outside, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. You can see the outline of the bridge through the oiled linen, a faint charcoal sketch that wavers when a breath of air stirs the covering, and you can hear the river's voice still there, threading through the thin walls of the hut as if it were the very pulse of the place. The kettle lets out a soft, rising whistle, not shrill but steady, and the keeper lifts it from the hook with a twist of cloth to protect his hand. He pours the steaming water over the tea leaves in a thin, deliberate stream, and the cup fills with a color that shifts from pale green to warm amber as the leaves steep. He sets the kettle aside on the flagstone, where a wisp of steam continues to curl upward and disperse among the rafters, and he carries the cup to the 3-legged stool by the door. Sitting there with the door still ajar, he holds the cup in both hands, the warmth soaking through the earthenware into his palms, and he looks out at the river with the stillness of someone who has no need to be anywhere else. The mist, which had lain so thick upon the water that you could hardly tell where the river ended and the air began, now begins to thin in the slow, inescapable way of mist when the sun climbs higher behind the clouds. It does not burn off in a single dramatic moment, but instead loosens its hold strand by strand, revealing first the nearer alder trees on the far bank, their bare winter branches sketching a delicate net against the pale sky, then the shape of a meadow beyond them, cropped short by sheep and still grey with frost in the shadows. The crow, noticing perhaps some shift in the light, lifts itself from the mud and flies upstream with a few steady wing beats before settling again on a fence post nearly lost in the distance. The river itself seems to brighten, the pewter of early dawn gradually warming into a brownish green where the water runs shallow over a gravel bed, and the heron that had been standing motionless on the far side unfolds itself in one slow, deliberate motion and drifts away low over the surface without a sound. The keeper drinks his tea in small, unhasty sips, and after a time he sets the empty cup on the floor beside the stool and leans his shoulder against the doorframe. His attention settles on the bridge, its dark timbers now fully visible and the toll bar still lowered, the iron counterweight at its near end hanging quietly against its post. A thin film of moisture covers every surface, and you can see how the wood has been worn smooth in places by the passage of countless hands and the rubbing of ropes over many years. The bridge creaks once, a single soft note, as the timbers adjust to the temperature of the day and then fall silent again, except for the endless murmur of the water below. The toll box, a simple wooden chest fixed to a post beside the bar, shows a narrow slot in its lid where pennies will soon fall. But at this hour, no farmer or drover is yet on the road, and the lane that leads from the hill down to the crossing remains empty and quiet. Inside the hut, the fire settles into a steady glow, the block of peat burning with a low, even heat that sends a thin blue-white smoke curling up the chimney, where it joins the outside air and mingles with the last tatters of mist still clinging to the top of the thatch. You notice the small details of the room more clearly now, the way the light catches the grain of the deal table tucked under the window, the neat row of wooden pegs driven into the wall for hanging coats and a lantern, the ledger on the shelf that waits for the day's entries, with its cover faintly stained by the damp of many mornings. The keeper's woolen coat has dried in the warmth, and the fibres have begun to smell softly of lanolin, a scent that blends with the peat smoke and the earthy damp of the river to form a single quiet atmosphere that asks nothing of you beyond your presence. At length the keeper rises, stretches his arms in the slow, easy motion that makes the joints of his shoulders pop faintly, and then walks out to the toll bridge a second time, this time without hurry, but with the step of someone beginning his appointed round. You follow in thought and see him run his hand along the toll bar, feeling the wetness of the wood and the slight roughness where the grain has lifted. He peers over the edge of the bridge into the water, where a small school of minnows hovers in the shadow of a pier, their bodies flickering like tiny splinters of silver caught in the current. The sky overhead has now shifted to a pale, even grey that seems to stretch from horizon to horizon without seam, a soft dome of light that casts no harsh shadows and promises neither rain nor clear sun, only the continuation of a day that will unfold in small, familiar acts. He checks the fastening of the toll bar's rope, tugs once, and finds it secure, just as he knew it would be. A wagon rut in the near bank, filled with last night's rainwater, reflects the sky in a small, still pool, and the wren darts from a bramble bush, alights on the top rail of the bridge for 3 seconds, and flitters away. The only sound now, beyond the river's perpetual wash, is the distant, intermittent lowing of cattle somewhere up the valley, a sound so muffled by distance and damp air that it could almost be mistaken for the wind moving through the bare branches of an oak. The keeper lifts his gaze to the lane that climbs the slope and disappears into a hedgerow, and for a long moment he simply stands there, his hands resting on the wet wood, watching the empty track with the patience of someone who has learned that things will arrive precisely when they are meant to and not a moment before. The mist has gone entirely now, leaving the valley clean and open, and you can see the whole course of the river winding between its banks. Here a smooth glide, there a riffle of white where a submerged stone breaks the surface. The thatch of the hut, seen from this side, is a mix of brown and grey, mottled and patched in places where a new layer was added in autumn, and a thin wisp of smoke still rises from the chimney and loses itself in the broad, colourless sky. The keeper turns and walks slowly back toward the hut, his boots leaving dark impressions in the wet grass, and as he reaches the door he pauses to look over his shoulder one last time at the bridge, the river, and the far bank where the crow has now returned to its patch of mud, scratching and pecking with the same methodical rhythm as before. Once inside, he closes the door most of the way, leaving just a crack wide enough to let in a sliver of daylight and the sound of the water. He takes the ledger from the shelf, sets it on the table, and opens it to a fresh page, smoothing the paper with the side of his hand. The inkwell, a small pottery jar with a cork stopper, he uncovers, and places beside the book, and he tests the point of a quill on his thumb before laying it parallel to the spine. Everything is ready, the toll box fixed and empty, the fire warm, the tea leaves still damp in the cup, and the quiet of the morning settled around the hut like a blanket that no one has thought to fold away. He lowers himself onto the stool and clasps his hands loosely in his lap, his breathing so slow and even that you find yourself matching it without meaning to, and together, you and the keeper and the river wait for the first sound of hooves on the packed earth, the first bleat of a sheep, the first penny of the day that will drop into the box with its small, definite chink, as the mist gives way fully to the pale, unhurried light of a morning that will last as long as mornings last in this cornet bend of the Wye. After the mist has fully lifted and the valley lies open under that pale, even sky, you stand near the toll bar and let the stillness settle around you like the lingering warmth of the fire inside the hut. The keeper has taken his place of the bridge, his hands resting lightly on the damp wood, and you notice how the morning has sharpened the edges of things. The stone piers are now a clear grey, the river a steady ribbon of brownish green, and each twig of the alders on the far bank drawn sharp against the clouded light. The water continues its endless murmur, a sound that has not altered since before you arrived and will not alter long after you leave. And into that steady hush slips a new, thin note from somewhere up the lane. You hear it first as a slight disturbance in the quiet, a thread of sound that might be only the wind catching a loose branch. But as it grows, it resolves into the high, bleating call of sheep, the voices not loud but persistent, carrying through the damp air as though the mist had left behind a resonance that amplifies small noises. Beneath the bleating there comes another sound, the irregular clip of many small hooves on packed earth, and you imagine the lane winding up the slope between hedgerows that are still bare with winter except for the first tight buds of hawthorn. The keeper turns his head toward the track, his expression unchanged except for a slight focusing of his gaze, and he waits without shifting his weight, the way someone waits who has stood in this spot for many mornings and expects nothing more than the ordinary. The sounds draw nearer, the bleats separating into individual voices, some high and sharp from lambs, others lower and more guttural from the ewes, and the footfalls become a soft, broken rhythm that you can almost feel through the ground. The lane emerges from a gap in the hedgerow, perhaps 100 yards up the slope, and presently a shape moves there. A dark, broad-brimmed hat first, then a set of shoulders in a brown felt coat, and finally a slow-moving press of woolly bodies clustered behind. The farmer leads his flock with a relaxed, ambling stride, a hazel stick held loosely in one hand, and the sheep follow him, not in a straight line but in a loose, shifting cloud, their heads bobbing and their fleeces swaying as they walk. The keeper does not call out. He simply watches, and you watch with him, seeing how the farmer's coat is worn at the elbows and hem, how the wide brim of his hat shades his face, how the stick he carries has been polished smooth by years of handling. The sheep are caveats. You can tell by their clean white faces and pricked ears, and their wool hangs heavily, carrying the deep, fatty scent of lanolin that reaches you even before they arrive at the bridge. There is also a faint sweetness underneath, the memory of clover from the lower pastures where they must have been folded late last autumn, a scent that mingles with the clean damp of the river and the peaty tang of the hut's smoke. When the farmer draws close, he raises his head just enough for the brim of his hat to reveal a weathered face, lines at the corners of his eyes, and a mouth set in a mild, neutral expression that holds no hurry. He calls a greeting, the words low and shaped by the local accent, something that might be mourning, or might simply be a sound of acknowledgement, and the keeper answers with a dip of his chin, a gesture that carries the same practical economy. No further conversation passes between them because none is needed. The routine is old and familiar, worn smooth as the wood of the toll bar. The farmer halts his flock with a slight raising of his stick, and the sheep stop at once, bunching together in a soft, breathing mass that fills the near end of the lane. One ewe lowers her head to nibble at a patch of grass at the verge, another stamps a foot as if to settle herself, and a lamb presses close to its mother's flank, its fleece still tight and crimped compared to the heavier wool of the older animals. You can see the individual clumps of mud dried on their legs, the small dark seeds caught in the fleece, the way their breath puffs faintly in the air that has not yet fully warmed. From his belt the farmer draws a leather purse, the leather dark and supple from handling, and he loosens the drawstring with a practiced slowness that seems to slow the whole seam further, as if each second is given its full measure. The keeper extends his right hand, palm up, the skin weathered and lined, and into that palm the farmer counts 4 coins, each one a copper halfpenny, the metal dull and touched with verdigris at the edges. He counts them one at a time, his lips moving slightly but no sound coming out, and each coin lands with a small, warm weight that speaks of a long journey inside the purse against the farmer's thigh. You notice the rhythm. A coin, a pause, a coin, a pause, until 4 halfpennies rest on the keeper's palm, the toll for 8 sheep at 1 penny for every 2 head. The keeper closes his fingers over the coins and turns to the toll box, the simple wooden chest fixed to the post beside the bar with a narrow slot across its lid. He drops the first halfpenny through the slot and you hear the small definite chink as it strikes the other coins already waiting inside, a sound swallowed quickly by the river's deeper voice, but still distinct enough to mark the transaction. The second coin follows with the same unhurried movement, then the third and finally the fourth, each drop a deliberate act that seems to have its own small gravity. When the last coin has fallen, the keeper brushes his palms together once, a habitual motion that scatters nothing but the memory of the coin weight, and he turns back to the bar. The farmer has been watching this with the same quiet patience, his stick still held across his body, his sheep breathing steadily behind him. He nods once, a small, economical nod that communicates everything necessary, and the keeper walks to the end of the toll bar, places both hands on the smooth wood, and lifts it upward. The bar rises on its iron hinge with a soft groan, the counterweight at the far end swinging down to hold it in place, and the way across the bridge stands open. The planks, dark and still damp from the earlier mist, stretch ahead in a long, mute invitation, and the river beneath them slides past with an unchanging murmur that seems to underline the quiet rather than disrupt it. The farmer makes a low sound with his tongue and taps his stick lightly against the ground, and the flock begins to move forward as a single body. The ewes first, then the lambs, their small hooves finding the first planks of the bridge and beginning that soft broken rhythm of wood on hoof. The keeper steps aside and stands with his hand still on the raised bar, watching the animals pass, and you find a place near the railing where you can observe without obstructing. The sheep cross not in a line but in a tight, patient group, their shoulders brushing, their fleeces rubbing with a faint, soft rasp. Each hoof fall is a small, quick tap, and the many taps overlap into a continuous dry patter that rises and falls as the animals adjust their pace. The bridge timbers respond with a gentle vibration that you can feel through the soles of your shoes, a low, alive tremor that travels up through the wood and into your bones and then dissipates into the river air. You notice the way the sheep hold their heads, some looking straight ahead toward the far bank, others glancing down at the water between the planks with a brief, incurious flick of the ear. The scent of them fills the bridge, the warm wool smell, the faint earthiness of the mud on their legs, the sweet hay of their breath, and it hangs all around you as the flock moves past, with the slow, inevitable progress of cloud shadow crossing a field. The lead ewe, a large animal with a particular steady step, reaches the far bank first and steps off the last plank onto the turf there, pausing to shake her head once, which makes her ears flap, and then she lowers her muzzle to the grass and begins to pull at it with a soft, tearing sound. The others follow, one by one, each crossing the threshold from bridge to meadow, and the patter of their hooves thins out until only the last lamb, a small spindly-legged creature, pauses in the middle of the bridge to bleat once, a high, thin cry that echoes briefly against the water before it scampers to catch up with its mother. Now the flock is entirely on the far side, spreading out into the meadow, where the grass grows short and silvery with the remnants of dew, and the sound of their hooves fades into the soft, muffled footfalls of animals walking on turf. The farmer, who has waited until the last lamb crossed, steps onto the bridge himself, his boots making a deeper, heavier sound on the planks, and he walks across with the same unhurried stride, his hazel stick tapping once at the midpoint where a knot in the wood catches the tip. He reaches the far bank, nods again without turning around, and then he and his flock begin to climb the gentle slope beyond, their shapes growing smaller and less distinct as they move toward a distant gate that opens onto a track leading to the Monmouth Road. The bleats become fainter, scattered, and then they are just a memory on the air. indistinguishable from the lowing of cattle that had been sounding far up the valley all morning. The keeper lowers the toll bar again, the iron counterweight shifting with a muted clunk, and the bar settles into its slot with a solid, final sound. He runs his hand along its top edge in that same absent, checking motion, feeling for any splinters or wetness that might need attention, and finding none, he lets his arm drop to his side. The bridge is empty now, the planks marked only by a few small clods of earth that the sheep's feet carried onto the wood, and the river underneath continues to wash against the piers with its timeless repetitive hush that does not acknowledge the small interruption that has just passed. You stand there a little longer, letting the quiet return, and you notice how the lane behind you has fallen silent once more. The hedgerows empty, the distant fields still. The keeper walks back toward the hut, his boots leaving dark prints in the wet grass, and he pauses at the door to look once more at the bridge, a habit that seems built into his muscles, before ducking inside to make an entry in his ledger. The crow that had been scratching in the mud on the far bank earlier has moved to a new patch of gravel beside a tussock of sedge, and it picks there with the same mechanical rhythm, undisturbed. The valley, which for a few minutes had been filled with the bleating of sheep and the clatter of hooves, has returned to its ordinary stillness. The soft, steady breath of the river, the only sound. And you realize that the day has hardly begun. That there will be other farmers, other flocks, other pennies dropping into the box, each one a small point of sound in the long, slow sentence of the toll-keeper's day. After the farmer and his flock have disappeared over the far crest and the bridge has returned to its quiet state, the keeper walks back across the wet grass to the hut, his boots leaving a trail of dark prints that will soon fade as the sun climbs higher behind a cloud cover. He pauses at the door to look over his shoulder, a habit so deeply worn into his muscles that it seems part of his breathing, and he sees the lane still empty, the hedgerows unstirring, the crow still working its patch of gravel on the far bank with the same patient, unchanging rhythm. Satisfied that no second traveller is yet approaching, he pushes the door fully open and steps inside, where the fire has settled into a bed of glowing peat that gives off a steady, low warmth and a thin curl of blue-white smoke. The interior of the hut, after the pale brightness of the outdoors, feels dim and close in a way that is not unpleasant, but simply different, a small pocket of older light and older smells. He crosses to the shelf on the back wall, the one that holds the tin kettle, the bread, and the salt crock, and from beside the loaf he lifts down a thin ledger bound in brown leather that has gone smooth and dark at the corners from years of handling. The ledger is not heavy, but he carries it with both hands, as if the weight of the numbers inside it gives it a certain substance, and he sets it down on the small deal table that stands beneath the window. The table's surface is scrubbed pale, almost white in places, and the grain of the deal runs in long, wavy lines that catch the light when you look at them from an angle. You watch from near the hearth, where the warmth presses gently against your back, and you see the keeper draw the three-legged stool close to the table and sit down, the wood of the stool creaking once under his weight. He opens the ledger to a page about a third of the way through, a page that already bears several columns of entries in a narrow, upright script, the ink faded now to a rusty brown. The earlier entries speak of the previous week's crossings, a drove of pigs, a cart of hay, a single cow that must have wandered loose and been returned for a penny. Each line is a quiet record of a small event, and together they form a pattern as regular as the growth rings in a felled ash tree. The keeper runs his thumb down the edge of the page, feeling the slight ruffle of the paper where the damp air has ever so slightly cockled the fibres. And then he reaches for the inkwell that sits permanently at the back corner of the table. The inkwell is a squat pottery jar, glazed a dark brown on the outside and unglazed at the rim, and its cork stopper fits snugly, though it has been stained black around the edges from many years of use. He pulls the stopper with a soft, sucking pop and sets it aside, revealing the ink inside, a dark, still pool that reflects a tiny warped image of the rafters overhead. Beside the inkwell lies a quill, a goose feather cut to a clean point, its barb stripped away except for a small tuft left near the top for appearance, and he picks it up between his thumb and forefinger, testing the point on the pad of his thumb before dipping it. The motion of dipping the quill is slow and exact. He lowers the nib into the ink, holds it there for a count of 2, and then lifts it, tapping it once against the inner rim of the jar to shed any excess. A single dark drop falls back into the well with a sound so small, it is barely a sound at all, more a slight disturbance in the surface tension. Then he bends over the ledger, and you see his left hand come up to smooth the page, his fingers spread wide to hold the paper flat against the table, while his right hand begins to write. The date comes first, set in the left margin in a neat unhurried script that follows a gentle downward slant, the day of the month, a short abbreviation from March, and the year, 1783, written with a small flourish on the final digit that he always gives without thinking. Beneath the date, he writes the name of the farmer, or at least the name as he has come to spell it over the years, a phonetic guess that has hardened into convention. John Parry, the letters small and even, the capital J, a simple downward hook. After the name he records the livestock in a brief note, 8 Cheviot sheep, and then, in the column at the far right, the sum, 2d. The numerals are formed with the same care, the 2 a neat loop, the D for pence a small curled abbreviation, and when he lifts the quill from the page, the last stroke leaves a tiny tail of ink that sits wet and glossy on the paper for a few seconds before drying. He blots the entry with a scrap of woolen felt that lies beside the ledger, pressing it down with 2 fingers in a gentle, even pressure that soaks up any excess ink without smearing the words. The scrap of felt is stained with 100 previous blottings, its surface mottled in shades of blue, black and brown, and when he lifts it away the entry beneath is crisp and clean, the paper only slightly sheened where the ink has penetrated. He sets the felt aside and returns his gaze to the numbers, running his finger slowly down the column of sums that he has entered over the past days, his lips moving faintly as he adds them again in his head. The totals are small and will always be small, 34 pence and 2 farthings from the day before, a little more or a little less from the day before that, but he adds them anyway with the same methodical attention, as if the act of checking is more important than the result. His finger moves from line to line, pausing at each while he murmurs a number under his breath, and then he nods once, satisfied that the arithmetic is correct, just as it always has been. While the ledger lies open, the light through the window shifts slightly, a cloud passing over the sun somewhere high above the valley, and for a moment the page dims and then brightens again, the shadows of the rafter beams sliding across the tabletop like slow, silent fingers. The keeper does not look up. He closes the ledger with the same careful motion he uses for everything, aligning the front cover with the back, and then he places the quill parallel to the book's spine and recorks the inkwell. For a few moments he simply sits at the table, his hands resting on the closed ledger, and his gaze drifts toward the window, where the river is visible as a strip of moving light between the doorframe and the jamb. The sound of the water, that steady wash against the piers, fills the hut as fully as the scent of peat smoke, and you sense that he is listening to it in the way a person might listen to a clock in a quiet room, not to count the hours, but to let the rhythm hold his thoughts in place. Later in the day, after the mid-morning crossings of a cart carrying sacks of barley and a woman with a single goat on a rope, the keeper opens the ledger again. You have remained near the hut, content to drift in and out of the doorway, and you see him settle once more at the table, the stool creaking under him with the same low note. The morning has aged into a soft grey noon, and a weak sun has begun to break through the cloud cover in thin, watery beams that touch the river and turn it briefly into a sheet of hammered pewter before withdrawing again. The keeper dips the quill, taps it on the rim, and adds a new entry, a cart and 2 horses, 1 penny, the driver, a man whose name he guesses as Thomas Lloyd. The ink goes down wet and glistening, dries under the felt blotter, and becomes just another line in the long, patient record. By the time the afternoon arrives, the light has swung around to fall more directly through the window, and a warm golden stripe lies across the tabletop, illuminating the grain of the deal in vivid detail. You can see every small notch and haul in the wood, the faint circular marks left by a plane, and the deeper scratch marks near the edge where a previous keeper, years ago, once pressed too hard with a quill and left a permanent groove. The keeper places the ledger directly in this stripe of light, and the page seems to glow, the old entries appearing as faint brown ghosts, the new entries dark and sharp. He adds the noon crossing, 1 goat, a halfpenny, paid in 2 farthings counted out by a woman. The farthings column he writes with a small fraction, the numeral 1/4, the ink exactly the same shade as the river water when it runs shallow over a gravel bed. A longer pause follows, during which the keeper rises to put another block of peat on the fire and to pour himself a cup of water from a jug that stands in the coolest corner of the hut. You watch him drink standing up, his throat moving slowly, and then he returns to the stool and pulls the ledger toward him once more, not to write, but to look. He leafs back through the pages, turning them one by one with a dampened thumb. And you see the columns of figures stretching backward through the weeks and months, each line a small, quiet footprint of a day that was once just like this one. There are entries for sheep and cattle, for pigs and geese, for carts loaded with coal or hay, for single riders on horseback, and for the rare post-chaise that would pay sixpence and leave the keeper with a sense of wealth that never lasted beyond the closing of the book. The handwriting changes as the pages go back. Sometimes it is his own, younger and tighter, and sometimes it is the hand of the keeper before him, a man named Owen, whose capital letters had a distinctive backward slant. The paper near the binding smells faintly of damp and dust, a library of small transactions. He closes the ledger again, and this time does not open it. The afternoon light shifts another inch across the table, and the river outside continues its endless, patient murmur, a sound that seems to have been there before the bridge, and will be there after it. The keeper allows his thoughts to settle into that steady rhythm without the need to follow them anywhere. They drift like the fallen leaves that spin slowly in the eddies near the bank, turning and turning, but never moving far from their point of origin. You feel yourself drifting too, caught in the same slow current, and the numbers in the ledger, the names, the dates, all blur into a single quiet hum that asks nothing from you except your presence. Outside, the crow has moved to the top rail of the bridge and sits there with its head cocked, listening to something only it can hear, and the valley holds its breath in the long suspended moment between one toll and the next. Later in the morning, when the sun has climbed high enough to thin the cloud cover into a soft, milky brightness, and the shadows of the alders on the far bank have shortened to dark pools around their roots, a new sound begins to build in the lane beyond the hedgerow. At first it is only a faint, low throb, so deep that you feel it through the soles of your boots before you properly hear it, a rhythmic pressure in the packed earth that has nothing to do with the light patter of sheep or the rattle of cartwheels. The keeper, who has been sitting on the three-legged stool just inside the open door with his cup of water resting on his knee, lifts his head and turns his ear toward the track, and you see his shoulders straighten almost imperceptibly as he identifies the source and sets the cup aside. You follow him outside and take up a position near the toll bar, where the wood has dried in the strengthening light to a warm, silvery grey, and the iron counterweight hangs motionless against its post. The sound grows steadily, resolving out of that low throb into distinct, heavy footfalls, each one a deep, blunt thud followed by a pause that is filled by the next thud, and then the next, a slow, swinging rhythm that speaks of large bodies moving at a walk. Underneath the footfalls you now catch the occasional rustle of hide brushing hide, the creak of horn against horn as an animal turns its head, and the short, gusty breaths of cattle that have been driven since first light over the hill tracks. The first shape to emerge from the gap in the hedgerow is a broad white face, the forehead wide and flat between two ears, set low and wide, the eyes dark and placid under a fringe of coarse, reddish curls. The lead cow steps fully into view and pauses, her head swinging slowly from side to side as she takes in the sight of the bridge, and the water, and the open meadow beyond. And behind her the rest of the herd ambles into view, their bodies filling the lane from hedgerow to hedgerow, in a solid, slow-moving river of red-brown coats and pale muzzles. They are Hereford cattle, deep-bodied and thick-boned, their hides a rich, earthy red that catches the muted sunlight and holds it like the nap of a worn velvet coat, their white faces and white throat latches standing out in clean, bold contrast. Some have small, upturned horns that gleam faintly at the tips, while others are polled, their broad crowns smooth and rounded. Their flanks rise and fall with deep, even breathing, and the smell of them reaches you even before the lead cow has taken another step. The warm, sweet, sour scent of hide and sweat, the grassy tang of cud, the clean, dusty smell of trodden earth that clings to their hooves. The drover appears after the first few cows, walking not at the head of the herd but somewhere in the middle, where the animals are thickest and most inclined to wander, and he carries a long hazel stick with the bark still on it, polished dark by his palm. His coat, a heavy woolen garment of indeterminate brown, is patched at both elbows with a different, darker cloth. The stitches small and neat, and surely the work of someone at home by evening candlelight, and his wide-brimmed felt hat has a soft sweat-stained band and a dent in the crown that has been there so long it looks intentional. He walks with the slow, rolling stride of a man accustomed to matching his pace to the pace of cattle, and when he glances up at the keeper, he offers a single nod that takes in the whole scene at once: the bridge, the toll bar, the hut, the man who waits beside it. The keeper walks to the toll bar and stands there with his hands resting on the wood, waiting while the lead cow comes to a stop directly in front of the lowered barrier. She does not press against it or show any sign of restlessness, but simply halts, her heavy head sinking slightly, and you watch her nostrils flare as she draws in the scent of the river and the moss on the stone piers and the damp, cold air that rises from the water. A soft cloud of breath blows from her muzzle into the cool air, condensing briefly into a small white puff that drifts sideways and disperses over the dark timbers, and then she stands perfectly still, her sides moving in and out with the slow, deep rhythm of her lungs, her tail swishing once, twice, and then hanging still. Behind her the other cows bunch up, their bodies easing into a compact, patient mass that fills the lane with the sound of breathing and the occasional soft lowing of a younger animal somewhere near the back. The drover makes his way forward through the herd, his stick held lightly across his body and his shoulders turning this way and that to slip between the warm, solid bodies, and the cows shift aside for him without hurry, acknowledging his presence with a flick of an ear or a half-turn of a heavy head. When he reaches the front, he stands for a moment beside the lead cow, one hand resting flat on her shoulder, in a gesture that looks both fond and practical. And then he reaches into the deep pocket of his coat and draws out a small canvas pouch with a drawstring that has been knotted and reknotted many times. He works the knot loose with his fingers, the nails of which are short and rimmed with a fine line of dirt, and from the pouch he counts out 9 pennies, copper coins worn thin and smooth at the edges, their faces nearly blank from years of passing from hand to hand. He counts them not onto his own palm, but directly onto the keeper's outstretched hand. 1 penny for each head, numbering them aloud in a low, unhurried voice that matches the pace of his counting. 1, 2, 3, and so on up to 9, each number dropping into the quiet air like a small stone into still water. The keeper receives each coin with the same unhurried attention, letting them accumulate on his palm until the small mound of copper sits heavy and warm. And then he turns to the toll box and begins to drop the pennies through the slot one by one. Each coin strikes the coins already inside with a measured chink that is deeper and thicker than the sound made by the lighter half-pennies of the morning, a sound that seems to carry more weight, and you hear the small, layered clatter as the 9th penny settles onto the others, and then silence returns to the box. The keeper walks to the end of the toll bar without any word, because the counting has said everything that needs to be said, and he places both hands on the smooth wood and lifts it upward. The bar rises with a low groan from the iron hinge, the counterweight at the far end dropping with a dull, solid thunk, and the way across the bridge stands open. The drover makes a soft clicking sound with his tongue and taps the lead cow once, lightly, on the shoulder with the tip of his stick, and the animal steps forward onto the first planks of the bridge with a heaviness that sends a low, deep tremor through the timbers and up into the keeper's boots. The sound that follows is not the light, dry patter of sheep's hooves, but a deep, slow creak, a long, repeating groan that speaks of old wood bearing a great weight after many days of bearing only small ones. The bridge timbers, those thick, dark planks laid across the stone piers, flex under the cow's feet, and the creak they make is a long, drawn-out note, not loud, but deep, like the sound a great door makes when it is opened in an empty house. You can feel the vibration through the planks where you stand near the railing, a low hum that travels through the soles of your shoes and settles in the bones of your ankles, and then your shins, and you watch as the second cow steps onto the bridge and adds her weight to the first, the creak deepening and lengthening into a slow rolling chord that seems to have its own rhythm. The cattle move in a slow, swaying line, each animal stepping carefully onto the strange surface with a moment of hesitation at the threshold before committing its full weight, and the bridge answers each step with its own deep voice. The lead cow has reached the middle now, where the span is longest and the timbers have the most give, and the creak that comes from under her hooves is a long, resonant groan that seems to hang in the air for a full breath before it fades, only to be replaced by the next groan from the cow behind her. It is a sound that repeats and repeats, but never exactly the same way twice. Sometimes a higher pitch when a lighter heifer steps, sometimes a deep, almost subsonic thrum when one of the great heavy bullocks crosses, and the whole structure of the bridge trembles with a low, continuous vibration that you can feel climbing from your feet up into your knees and hips. A quiet, trembling energy that is almost like the hum of a struck bell, but far slower. The keeper stands with his hand still on the raised toll bar, his gaze moving from one cow to the next, and you notice that he is counting them under his breath as they pass, just as he counted the pennies, checking the tally against his memory of the coins that went into the box. His lips move slightly, forming the numbers from 1 to 9, and when the last cow, a smaller, younger animal with a patch of white on its forehead that looks like a star, steps onto the bridge and adds its lighter weight to the collective burden, he nods faintly and lets his shoulders settle into a slightly easier line. The drover waits on the near bank until the last cow has moved a few paces onto the bridge, and then he steps onto the planks himself, his boots making a quicker, sharper sound that is different from the slow, rolling thud of the cattle's hooves, a rhythm that skips across the surface while the deeper creak continues beneath it. Now the whole herd is on the bridge, 9 red-brown bodies moving in a slow, living column, their white faces bright against the grey sky and the darker grey of the river below. And the bridge groans under their weight with a music that is both ancient and entirely ordinary. You watch the lead cow pause at the midpoint, perhaps to look down at the water sliding past beneath her, and the second cow comes up behind and nudges her flank gently with her nose, a quiet communication that says without words to keep moving, and the lead cow resumes her walk with a heavy, swinging step that sends a fresh tremor through the wood. The river underneath continues its own steady sound, a soft, liquid hush that never stops, and the two sounds together, the creak of the bridge and the murmur of the water, form a kind of slow, deep conversation that has been going on for longer than anyone can remember. You feel the vibration diminish as the lead cow reaches the far bank and steps off the last plank onto the meadow turf there, her weight suddenly absorbed by the solid earth rather than the flexible wood, and the bridge lets out a long, settling sigh as its burden lessens. The second cow follows, then the third, and with each one the creaking softens and the tremor in the planks grows fainter, until by the time the fifth cow is crossing there is only a low, intermittent groan, and by the eighth there is almost silence. The last cow, the one with the star on its forehead, pauses for just a moment at the edge of the bridge to snatch a mouthful of grass from the verge before crossing, and its lighter weight produces only the faintest creak, a sound that could almost be the bridge simply breathing out. When all 9 cattle are safely on the far bank, spreading out across the meadow and lowering their heavy heads to graze, and the drover has crossed and is already a dozen paces up the far slope with his stick resting across his shoulder, the bridge falls completely still. The only sound now is the river, that ever-present murmur that seems to rise up and polish the quiet rather than break it, smoothing away the memory of the creaking and the deep vibration until the crossing might never have happened at all. The keeper lowers the toll bar back into its slot, the counterweight shifting with its familiar solid sound, and he runs his hand along the top of the wood as he always does, a quick, checking motion that finds nothing out of place. You stand near the railing and look down at the water, watching the way it slides past the stone piers with that same unchanging rhythm, as if the weight of 9 cattle had been nothing more than the shadow of a passing cloud, and you feel the stillness settle back around you like a familiar, comfortable coat. The morning has not yet reached noon, and the lane is empty again, but the memory of the deep, slow creak of the bridge will linger in your thoughts for a while longer, a low, quiet music that has already become part of the day's gentle fabric, something to be recorded later in the ledger with 9 neat numerals and the initial of the drover whose name the keeper will guess at as best he can. When the sun climbs to its highest point and stands directly over the river so that the shadows of the bridge piers shrink to nothing and the water itself seems to lose its color and become a wide ribbon of pale light. The keeper feels the quiet pull of an old, familiar hunger. The morning crossings have stretched out with their usual irregular rhythm. A cart, a single horse, 2 more sheep, and the last sound of hooves faded more than an hour ago, leaving the valley in a stillness that feels older than the hills. You are still near the hut, having wandered back from the bridge after the cattle crossed, and you watch the keeper move about his small space with the same unhurried, practiced economy that he applies to lifting the toll bar or entering a line in his ledger. He crosses to the hearth, where the block of peat he added earlier has burned down to a bed of glowing embers that pulse a deep, steady orange, and he takes from beside the chimney breast a small iron pot that hangs on a nail. The pot is blackened on the outside with a fine layer of soot that has been polished smooth by handling, and its inside gleams with the dull, metallic sheen of well-cured iron. He sets it carefully on the flagstone, crouching so that his knees creak softly, and then reaches for the shelf that holds his provisions, taking down a small crock of barley and a worn wooden board on which a single thick bleak rests, its white bulb and green tops still fresh enough from the morning's purchase at market 2 days prior. You watch him pour a handful of barley into the pot, the small pale grains running through his fingers with a soft, rustling sound, and you notice how he levels the handful with his thumb before letting it fall, a small gesture born of repetition. The barley settles across the iron bottom in a thin, even layer, and into it he crumbles a pinch of coarse salt taken from the little crock that always stands at the end of the shelf, its lid worn to a smooth dome. He then takes the leek, trims the root end with a single quick cut of a small knife that he draws from a leather sheath at his belt, and slices the white and pale green parts into thin rings directly over the pot. The knife makes a soft, crisp sound as it passes through the tender layers, and the rings fall in a loose scatter across the barley and salt, their faint, sweet onion smell lifting briefly into the warm air of the hut. He adds enough water from the jug to cover everything by 2 fingers' width, the water splashing softly against the iron sides, and then he lifts the pot by its bail and hangs it from the iron hook over the fire. The hook settles into its notch with a small, secure clink, and he adjusts the height so that the bottom of the pot sits just above the glowing peat, where the heat is steady without being fierce enough to scorch. While the pot begins its slow journey toward a simmer, the keeper turns to the other part of his meal. From a cool corner of the hut, where a loose stone slab in the floor keeps whatever rests on it a little colder than the rest of the room, he lifts a small wheel of cheese wrapped in a square of muslin that has been tied at the top with a twist of twine. The muslin is faintly spotted with butterfat, and when he unwraps it, the cheese gives off a mild, nutty scent, its surface the color of pale cream and slightly crumbly at the edges. He sets the wheel on the deal table and cuts a wedge with the same small knife, the blade sinking through the firm paste with a smooth, even pressure that parts the cheese cleanly, leaving a faint sheen on the cut surface. The wedge, when he lifts it away, is about the size of his thumb, and he places it on a thick wooden board that serves as his plate, its surface marked with the fine, shallow cross-hatching of many knife cuts. Beside the cheese, he cuts a thick slice of dark bread from the loaf that has been sitting wrapped in its linen cloth on the shelf. The bread is dense and heavy, its crust a deep burnished brown, and its crumbs shot through with the pale specks of coarsely ground barley and a little rye, and it gives off a faint, sour sweet smell that rises as the knife breaks the crust. He cuts the slice generously, a full inch thick, and then halves it with a single diagonal cut, because that is how he has always done it. The 2 triangles of bread go onto the board beside the cheese, and he turns the board so that the best light from the doorway falls across the arrangement, though he does not look at it for more than a moment before moving to pour his drink. From a stoneware jug that stands on the floor near the door he fills a brown earthenware cup with small ale, a drink so weak and mild that it is barely more than water that has passed through barley husks, and its color is a pale, cloudy amber. A thin rim of foam rises briefly at the surface and then settles back into the liquid with a soft, fading fizz. The cup has a chip at its rim, a small shallow notch that the keeper's lower lip finds every time without thinking, and it fits his hand comfortably, the curve of the handle worn smooth by years of use. He carries the cup and the board to the open doorway, and you step aside to let him settle himself on the three-legged stool that he has drawn up to the threshold, so that one shoulder leans against the doorframe and his feet rest on the packed earth of the doorstep. Sitting there, with the meal balanced on his knees and the bright, pale noon light falling across his lap, he becomes a small, still figure framed by the dark wood of the door, and you find a place to lean against the outer wall of the hut, where the thatch overhang gives a narrow strip of shade. The air outside is mild for early spring, with the faintest hint of warmth when the sun breaks fully through the high thin clouds and the river continues its endless quiet murmur. You can see, as the keeper does, the whole sweep of the water downstream, where it broadens into a gentle curve and the far bank shoals out into a gravel beach scattered with smooth, rounded stones. 2 swans are there, drifting with the current, their long white necks curved into easy, unhurried lines that mirror each other so closely they could almost be a single bird and its reflection. They move without any apparent effort, their bodies riding high on the water and their wakes trailing behind them in 2 narrow V-shaped ripples that spread and fade and are constantly renewed. The keeper picks up one of the triangles of bread and takes a small bite, chewing slowly, his jaw moving in a steady circular rhythm that matches the pace of the swans gliding downstream. After the bread, he cuts a sliver of cheese with his knife and places it on the bread, letting the warmth of his mouth soften the cheese before he chews again. He does not hurry. There is no need to hurry because the next toll will come when it comes, and not before, and the valley has never yet punished him for eating at his own slow pace. Between bites, he lifts the cup and drinks, the small ale cool and faintly bitter on the back of his tongue, and you see his eyes rest on the water with the detached, easy attention of someone who has looked at this river in every light and season and expects nothing new, but accepts whatever is given. The swans allow the current to carry them past the hut, their heads turning slightly to regard the bridge and the dark shape of the boat beneath it. But they show no alarm. They know this stretch of water as intimately as the keeper knows his toll box, and they have probably nested somewhere upstream among the reed beds for many seasons. Their feathers shine with a clean, waxy gloss that catches the noon light, and now and then one dips its head beneath the surface to pull at a strand of waterweed, raising its neck with a small, silvery cascade of droplets falling from its beak. You watch them until they have passed completely out of the frame of the doorway, moving on toward the bend where the alders lean over the water and cast a deep green shade. And then you look back at the keeper, who has reached for the small pot hanging over the fire inside. He rises from the stool, the board balanced in one hand, and walks the few steps to the hearth, where he lifts the iron lid from the pot with a twist of a rag and peers inside. The broth has come to a gentle simmer, the barley swelling and softening, the rings of leek turning translucent and tender, and the whole pot breathes a warm, savory steam that fills the hut with the deep smell of grain and allium and the faint, peaty note of the fire itself. He stirs the contents once with a wooden spoon that has a handle darkened from long use, the spoon moving in a slow, wide circle that catches every grain of barley and carries it gently back into the liquid. Satisfied, he leaves the lid off so the broth can thicken a little, and he returns to the doorway with his bread and cheese, pausing only to set the wooden spoon across the rim of the pot. Now the whole of the small meal comes together on his lap. The remaining bread, the last sliver of cheese, the cup of small ale, and the pot of broth that he will spoon up when it has cooled just enough. He settles more deeply onto the stool, his back finding the familiar angle of the door frame, and for a while he simply sits without eating, his eyes half closed against the brightness of the noon sky. It is a stillness so complete that you find your own breathing slowing to match it, and the boundary between the warmth of the fire inside the hut and the cool, damp air from the river outside seems to soften and blur into a single, comfortable temperature that asks nothing of your body. The river murmurs on, its surface now beginning to sparkle in patches where the light finds the riffles, and the sound of the water fills the silence with that steady, hushing note that is never absent and never intrusive. You notice, as the keeper does, that the light has changed slightly, the high, thin clouds pulling apart to let a wider, softer light pour down. And in that light, the world seems to hold its breath. A dragonfly appears from somewhere down near the rushes that grow in a dense stand just below the hut, its long, needle-thin body a brilliant blue that glints as it turns, and it flies in a quick, darting path up toward the bridge. The keeper follows its flight with a slow movement of his eyes, his head not turning at all, and you watch the dragonfly settle on the very top of the raised toll bar, its four glassy wings extended flat and motionless. It rests there for the length of a long, slow breath that you find yourself taking in and letting out in a measured, full cycle. And in that pause everything seems to hang suspended, the simmering barley, the half-eaten cheese, the two distant swans now invisible around the bend, and the keeper himself, his hands resting loosely in his lap. The wings of the dragonfly catch the light and refract it into tiny pinpoints of color that flicker and shift with each almost imperceptible movement of the insect's body. And then, without any warning or transition, the dragonfly lifts and is gone, arrowing away over the rushes with a dry, scraping buzz of its wings that you feel more than hear, a vibration in the air that fades as swiftly as it came. The keeper picks up his spoon and dips it into the pot, lifting a small portion of the barley and leek broth to his lips with the same careful slowness he uses for everything else. He blows once across the surface, a soft, steady stream of breath that makes the steam curl and twist, and then he sips, the liquid disappearing from the spoon with a quiet sound. The warmth of the broth travels down into his chest and spreads outward through his limbs, and you can almost feel it yourself, that simple animal comfort that comes from hot food taken in the middle of a day of quiet labor. He spoons up another mouthful, then another, pausing between each to chew the softened barley grains and to let the flavor settle. And as he eats, you notice that his gaze has drifted back to the river, where the sun now strikes the water in a long golden path that seems to start at the far bank and run directly toward the bridge. By the time he has finished the broth and sopped the last of the liquid from the pot with a crust of bread, the sun has passed its exact zenith and begun its slow, imperceptible slide toward the west, though the light does not yet change its quality. He sets the empty pot aside on the doorstep and wipes the spoon on the hem of his coat. Then he picks up the cup of small ale and drains the last mouthful, the cool, mild liquid cutting through the warmth of the barley broth with a clean, refreshing note. The board that held the bread and cheese now holds only a few crumbs and a faint smear of butterfat, and these he brushes into his palm with a sweep of his thumb and scatters outside onto the grass, where a small brown sparrow that has been watching from the thatch hops down at once to investigate. The keeper rises, stretches his arms upward with that same slow joint-popping stretch you observed in the early morning, and then walks back inside to return the pot to its nail and the board to its place on the shelf. The fire he leaves as it is, a low, steady glow that has burned down to a soft, incandescent heart of peat, and he adds a single fresh block more out of habit than necessity, settling it on top of the embers with the iron tongs. You remain near the doorway, and you watch him pause at the table where the ledger lies closed, and then pass on to the stool, where he sits once more, facing outward this time, his hands folded across his stomach. The warmth of the broth and the soft weight of the afternoon combine into a single sensation of stillness that requires no thought and invites no hurry. It is a pause that has repeated itself with only the smallest variations for more years than the keeper cares to count. The same barley, the same bread, the same cup of weak ale, the same quiet view through the same doorway, and the same slow, drifting contentment that settles over him like the thin, high clouds spreading their milky veil across the sky. You feel it wrap around you too, this gentle, unhurried interlude that asks nothing from the world beyond what it already gives. And for a while you neither think about the next toll nor the last, but simply exist in the soft, golden light that falls across the doorstep, listening to the river that continues to murmur its endless, patient story to anyone who cares to rest long enough to hear it. Between the midday meal and the late afternoon, the minutes stretch into a long, unbroken cotton thread of inactivity that winds itself softly around the hut and the bridge and the whole quiet valley. The keeper, having cleared away the pot and the board and the empty cup of small ale, moves through the early part of this stretch with the same unhurried, practical deliberation that marks all his actions. You remain near the doorway, reluctant to disturb the stillness, and you watch as he lifts a length of hemp rope from a wooden peg beside the chimney breast, coiling it over his arm with a loose, easy motion that speaks of years of handling cordage. The rope is thick as his thumb, its fibers a pale tan streaked with grey, where wear has polished the surface, and it carries a faint, dusty scent of the river mud it has trailed through many times. He carries the rope outside and down the gentle slope of the bank to the small stone landing directly below the bridge, where a wooden rowing boat lies tethered to an iron ring set into the pier. The boat is simple, clinker-built and tarred black along its seams, and it bobs almost imperceptibly on the water as the current shifts beneath it. The keeper kneels on the stone, his knees finding familiar hollows there, and he examines the short length of rope that secures the bow to the ring, his fingers tracing the frayed spot where the hemp has begun to unlay itself into a soft, whiskery brush of broken strands. With a small, blunt knife from his belt, he cuts away the frayed end, the blade making a crisp, clean sound as it parts the tight fibers, and he draws the new rope from his arm to lay it alongside the old. The splicing is a quiet, methodical task that occupies his hands completely, while his mind drifts free. You watch him unlay the strands at the end of the new rope, separating the 3 thick twists and tucking them back into the standing part, with a series of small, precise tucks, each one pulled snug, but not over tight. His fingers know the rhythm so well that he does not need to look at them. His gaze drifts out over the water, where the 2 swans have reappeared from around the bend and are now resting in a slack eddy near the far bank, their heads tucked back against their wings in a posture of deep, still repose. The rope grows shorter and neater under his hands, the splice forming a smooth, tapered join that is stronger than any knot. And when he has finished, he pulls hard once against the ring, feeling the grip of the hemp and the solid resistance of the iron, and then he lets the rope fall slack again and rises, brushing the stone dust from the knees of his breeches. By the time he walks back up to the hut, the sky has begun to change. A thin, grey veil of cloud slides across the high, milky brightness that had held through noon, and the light in the valley shifts from pale gold to a soft, even silver. You see the change reflected on the river, which loses its sparkle and becomes a broad, moving sheet of pewter under a sky that now seems to lower itself slowly toward the hilltops. The air grows still, the earlier breath of wind that stirred the rushes dying away completely, and the valley enters that suspended listening state that comes just before rain. Even the crow, which had been working its way along the far bank with its patient, metronomic pecking, lifts its head once, turns a bright black eye toward the west, and flutters up into the branches of an alder to wait. The first drops fall so fine and light that you feel them as a cool, almost imperceptible touch on your skin before you hear them, and they hardly dimple the surface of the river at all. Instead, they lay a clean metallic sheen across the stone of the bridge and the dark wood of the toll bar, a glistening wet film that catches the silver light and holds it, turning the whole structure into something that looks freshly fashioned. The keeper, who has paused at the threshold of the hut, turns his face upward for a moment to feel the rain, and then he steps inside and props the door open with the same small wedge of wood he uses every time it rains, so that the sound and the smell can enter without the draught chilling the hearth. Inside the hut, the light has softened to a grey, pearlescent glow that seeps through the oiled window and fills the small room with a quiet, even dimness. You come in out of the drizzle and find a place near the hearth, where the peat fire has burned down to a deep, steady heart of orange embers that gives off a gentle, encompassing warmth. The keeper takes the iron poker, a simple rod with a hook at one end, and he kneels on the flagstone to reshape the embers, drawing them into a neat mound that will hold its heat through the wet afternoon. The poker slides into the glowing bed with a soft, grating hiss, and when he lifts it, the embers sigh and settle, small tongues of blue flame licking briefly over the dark surface of the peat before subsiding again. You watch the soft orange glow pulse and fade in a rhythm as ancient as the river itself, a rhythm that has no urgency and no destination, only a steady, living presence that fills the dim room with the quietest of comforts. The rain begins to fall more steadily now, a soft, persistent whispering against the thatch that sounds like 1,000 small, gentle voices speaking all at once but saying nothing, just a long, suzerain hush that blurs the edges of every other sound. Through the open doorway the river is visible as a grey-green band moving through a world that has become soft-edged and indistinct, the far bank dissolving into a haze of wet grass and blurred alders, and the toll bar darkens further under the rain to the colour of steeped tea, the wood soaking up the moisture until it gleams a deep, rich brown. The keeper settles onto his stool near the fire, the poker still held loosely in one hand, and he listens to the rain with the same calm, unexpectant attention he gives to the river on dry days, as if the sound were simply another thread in the long, slow fabric of his afternoon. Time moves in a way that is hard to measure during these quiet, rain-filled hours. You find yourself sinking into the rhythm of the fire and the rain and the river, the three sounds weaving together into a single, seamless blanket that wraps around the hut and holds it suspended. The keeper, after a long while, rises and adds a handful of dry twigs to the fire, the twigs catching with a brief, bright crackle that subsides quickly into the steady glow, and then he walks to the doorway to stand under the shallow overhang of the thatch, looking out at the bridge where the rain falls straight and fine, without wind, the drops perfectly vertical as they meet the planks. The lane is empty. The track up the hill, a faint, watery line that disappears into a grey veil, and no sound of hooves or wheels disturbs the steady hiss of the rain. It is during this long, quiet stretch that a single cart does eventually approach, though you hear it long before you see it, the sound of wooden wheels on wet earth, a low, grinding rumble that separates itself slowly from the sound of the rain. The keeper remains in the doorway, watching the lane, and presently a high, swaying load of hay appears at the gap in the hedgerow, so tall that it seems top-heavy and improbable, the damp, greenish-gold hay bundled tight and bound with ropes that glisten darkly with moisture. The cart is pulled by a single sturdy horse with a wet, patient face, and the driver sits hunched on the front board, his collar turned up and his hat pulled down, the brim shedding a small, steady stream of drips onto his shoulders. As the cart approaches the toll bar, the driver draws rein gently, the horse stopping with a soft, blowing breath, and the keeper steps out from under the thatch into the rain, which immediately darkens his coat across the shoulders. The driver, without dismounting, leans sideways and fumbles in a pocket beneath his coat, producing a single penny that gleams wetly as he holds it out. No words pass between the two men. The rain seems to make speech unnecessary, and the keeper simply accepts the coin, his fingers closing around its cold, slick surface, and then he walks to the toll box and drops it through the slot with a small, muffled chink that is half swallowed by the sound of the rain on the wood. He lifts the toll bar, the wet wood groaning slightly on its iron hinge, and the cart rumbles forward onto the bridge, the wheels making a soft, sucking sound on the wet planks. The driver has to duck beneath the lintel of the toll bar as he passes, his hat brushing the wood, and the high load of hay sways gently, a few loose strands caught by the damp air and carried down to float on the river's surface. The cart rolls across the bridge with a slow, grinding rhythm, the wheels leaving faint, parallel trails of moisture on the planks, and then it reaches the far bank and begins the climb up the opposite slope, its shape growing dimmer and dimmer in the rain, until it is no more than a smudge of darker grey against the general grey of the valley. The keeper lowers the bar again, the counterweight swinging with its familiar solid sound, and then he walks back to the hut through the rain, his boots squelching softly on the wet grass. Inside, he shakes the water from his coat with a single practiced motion and hangs it on a peg near the fire, where the warmth will slowly lift the damp from the wool. You watch the steam begin to rise from the coat in faint, curling wisps, carrying the clean, rainy smell out into the room, and the keeper returns to his stool, the firelight painting his face in warm, flickering tones. The rain continues its steady whisper against the thatch, and you notice that the trails left by the cart wheels and the bridge planks have already begun to dim and blur as the fine drizzle runs over them, erasing the evidence of the passing in less time than it took to record the penny in the ledger. The keeper does not open the ledger now. That task will wait until the rain stops and the light returns. Instead, he sits with his hands resting on his knees, his head slightly bowed, and you sense that he is drifting in that soft, borderless state that comes in quiet afternoons, where thoughts are not fully formed but float loosely across the mind, like the mist that used to rise over the river at dawn. The fire settles, the rain falls, and the river continues its endless, muted murmur under the bridge, a sound that seems to draw all the separate noises of the afternoon into itself, until there is only one quiet, continuous presence filling the hut and the valley. After a long, unmeasured interval, the rain begins to lighten, the whisper against the thatch softening to a scatter of individual drops, and then to a slow, intermittent drip from the eaves. The sky outside the doorway shifts from grey to a paler, silvery white, and the river begins to brighten again, its surface catching the new light in broad liquid gleams. The keeper rises, walks to the doorway, and removes the wooden wedge so that the door can swing open wider, letting in the fresh, rain-washed air that smells of wet earth, clean stone, and the green, growing scent of the rushes along the bank. He steps outside and you follow, feeling the ground soft and giving underfoot, the grass heavy with beads of moisture that cling to your shoes. The toll bar still drips slowly, each drop falling with a soft, distinct plink into a small puddle that has formed beneath it, and the bridge planks are dark and slick, reflecting the pale sky in long, wavering strips. The river, fuller now from the rain, runs a little faster, its surface broken here and there by small swirls where the current presses against the piers, but its voice remains the same, steady, unhurried hush it has always been. The keeper checks the rope he spliced earlier, finding it exactly as he left it, and then he walks to the center of the bridge, his boots making a soft, wet sound on the planks, and he stands there looking downstream, where the valley opens out into a wider, flatter landscape of fields and distant woods that are now emerging from the rain haze in soft, clean-edged shapes. A traveler is a rare event on such afternoons, and the single cart that passed has left no trace, its wheel marks completely rinsed away, its penny already resting among the others in the toll box. The keeper turns and walks back to the hut, his figure small against the broad grey-green sweep of the valley, and you remain on the bridge a little longer, listening to the river and the drip of the toll bar and the distant soft call of a thrush that has begun to sing hesitantly from a bush on the far bank. The quiet hours of afternoon stretch onward, unhurried and complete, each minute flowing into the next like the river itself, and you feel the deep, slow peace of this place settle over you again, as steady and as certain as the turning of the earth toward evening. On the day after market, the traffic comes from the opposite direction, the lane carrying farmers and drovers back toward their holdings with carts that are empty save for a few sacks of meal or a roll of cloth or a small barrel of salt, and the light has a different quality to it, a softer, more settled brightness that seems to fall across the valley without hurry. You wake inside the hut with the same sense of slow, unfolding time that is accompanied every morning by the bridge, and you see the keeper already up, standing in the open doorway with his cup of tea, looking not upstream toward the hill track but downstream, where the far lane emerges from the trees and crosses the meadow to meet the bridge. The river is still there, its voice unchanged, a steady, liquid hush that threads through every other sound, and the mist that rose from the water at dawn has already thinned to a few pale scarves drifting low among the alders. The first returning traveller appears while the keeper is still finishing his tea. You hear the sound of a single horse, its hooves a slow, steady plod on the packed earth, and then the creak of a two-wheeled cart, its axle ungreased in that particular way that makes it sing a low, wavering note with each revolution. The keeper sets his cup aside, wipes his hands on the front of his coat, and walks out to the toll bar, and you follow, feeling the damp grass brush against your shoes and the cool, clean air fill your lungs. The cart rolls into view from the direction of the Monmouth Road, its driver a man the keeper knows by the set of his shoulders, a broad, square shape under a faded blue coat that has been patched at the collar with a different, darker cloth. The cart is empty, except for a single sack of barley meal propped against the tailboard, its top tied with a twist of straw, and the horse is a steady old bay with a white star on its forehead and a patient, nodding gait. The man with the two-wheeled cart always stops to comment on the height of the river, and this day is no different. He draws rein gently, the cart creaking to a halt before the toll bar, and he leans forward on his seat, his elbows resting on his knees, to peer down at the water sliding past the piers. "She's up a little," he says, the words slow and without any great weight, as if he is observing the colour of the sky, and the keeper, who has heard this observation every week for years, nods once and says, "A little." The farmer then reaches into the pocket of his coat and draws out a single penny, the coin warm from his body where it has sat all through the market day, and he drops it into the keeper's palm with a small, friendly clink that seems to acknowledge the familiarity of the gesture. The keeper walks to the toll box, drops the penny through the slot, and lifts the bar, and the cart rolls across the bridge with that same low, wavering creak from the axle, the sound diminishing as it climbs the near lane and disappears between the hedgerows, leaving behind only the faint dusty scent of barley meal and the soft fading clop of hooves. A quarter of an hour passes before the next traveller arrives, and during that quarter hour the keeper returns to the hut and opens the ledger, not to write but to review the previous day's entries, his finger tracing the column of numbers while the river murmurs on, and a thrush sings its short, repeated phrase from somewhere in the rushes. You stay near the doorway, watching the far lane, and you see the next shape resolve out of the pale morning light, a woman with a donkey, the donkey's small, neat hooves picking their way along the verge, its long ears flicking forward and back with each step. The woman wears a grey woolen shawl wrapped close around her shoulders, the ends tucked into a broad leather belt, and she carries a cloth pouch that hangs from her wrist by a drawstring. Behind her, the donkey pulls a low, flat cart on which a single bolt of undyed wool cloth rests, rolled tight and tied with twine. She approaches the toll bar with the same quiet, self-contained air she always carries, and the keeper walks out to meet her, his step a little quicker than usual, not from hurry, but from a kind of gentle, unspoken recognition that passes between them. She does not speak, except to offer a small, brief smile that asks nothing more than a nod of receipt, and the keeper returns the nod with the same economy. From her cloth pouch she begins to count out her toll, which is a halfpenny for the donkey and cart, paid not in a single coin but in 6 farthings, the smallest copper pieces the mint produces, each one thin and light as a dried leaf, their edges worn nearly smooth. She counts them one by one onto the keeper's outstretched palm, her lips moving silently as she does so. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the coins landing in a small, neat stack that shifts slightly with each addition. The coins are warm from her hand, warmer even than the farmer's penny, and they carry a faint, clean scent of the lavender that must be stored in the same pouch, a small, unexpected sweetness that rises briefly into the damp river air. The keeper curls his fingers around the 6 farthings and carries them to the toll box, dropping them through the slot in a short, rapid series of chinks that sound like tiny bells falling into water. He lifts the bar, the iron hinge groaning softly, and the woman clicks her tongue once to the donkey, which steps forward onto the bridge with a patient, dainty tread, its cartwheels making a dry, rattling sound on the planks. The woman follows, her shoes making a softer, lighter sound than the farmer's boots, and as she passes the keeper, she glances at him with that same brief, undemanding smile, a moment of quiet connection that requires no words and leaves no trace except a faint warmth in the air. The donkey reaches the far bank, the cart bumps gently over the threshold from wood to earth, and then they are climbing the lane, their shapes growing smaller and more indistinct until the sway of the donkey's ears is the last thing visible before the hedgerow swallows them. The toll bar comes down again, the counterweight settling with its solid, satisfying sound, and the keeper stands for a moment with his hand on the wood, looking after the woman and her donkey, as if some small part of the morning's peace has gone with them. You stay near the railing, listening to the river, and you notice that the light has shifted slightly, the sun breaking through the high, thin clouds in a broad, diffuse wash that turns the water into a sheet of soft, shimmering silver. A pair of mallards come skimming low over the far meadow and land on the river with a long, splashing skid, their green heads glinting, and they settle at once into a slow, contented drift downstream, their tails wagging occasionally as they dabble at the surface. By mid-morning the pace of returns has picked up a little, though it remains as irregular and unhurried as ever, the traffic coming in small scattered clusters with long, empty stretches between. You watch a drover return with a herd of 6 sheep that he had taken to market the day before, the sheep looking no different than when they left, except perhaps a little thinner and a little quieter, their bleats subdued and their gait a touch slower. The drover pays his toll with 2 pennies, counting them out from a leather purse that is noticeably flatter than it was on the way to market, and he crosses the bridge without conversation, because the weariness of the journey has settled into his bones and made words seem unnecessary. The sheep patter across the planks in a loose, tired group, their hooves making that same soft, broken rhythm, and then they disappear up the lane toward a farm that lies somewhere over the eastern ridge, their shapes merging with the brown and green of the hedgerow. Another quarter hour brings a cart loaded not with goods, but with a family, a man, a woman, and 2 small children who sit among a nest of empty sacks at the back, their faces still smudged with the dust of the market square, and their hands clutching sticky twists of barley sugar that they had been given as a treat. The man pays a penny, the same toll as any other cart, and he exchanges a few low, friendly words with the keeper about the price of pigs, which had been low at market, and the quality of the new cheese from the dairy at Monmouth, which had been high. The keeper listens and nods, his hands resting on the toll bar, and when the conversation dies a natural death, he lifts the bar and watches the cart trundle across, the children's small piping voices carried back on the still air as they point at the ducks on the water. The toll bar rises and falls in a slow, even pattern through the late morning and into the afternoon, sometimes with a half-hour of stillness between, sometimes with 2 carts in succession, so that the keeper has barely time to lower the bar before the next traveller comes into view. But he never alters his pace. He walks the same number of steps from his stool to the bar, opens the same fastening with the same unhurried motion, and drops each coin into the box with the same careful, deliberate attention, as if each penny were a word in a long and gentle sentence that is still being written. You find yourself settling into the rhythm of it, the rise and fall of the bar becoming almost like the rise and fall of a slow, steady breath, and the river underneath it all continues its ancient, patient murmur, the one constant in a day of small variations. At around the hour when the sun stands midway between its zenith and the western ridge, a solitary rider comes down the far lane on a tall grey horse, the animal's coat dappled with darker patches that seem to shift as it walks. The rider is a man in a dark coat and a tricorn hat, perhaps a dealer in wool or a clerk from the market, and he pulls up at the toll bar with a slight, formal nod. He pays his penny, a single coin that he flips through the air with a casual, practiced flick of his thumb, and the keeper catches it neatly, the coin slapping into his palm with a sound that is sharper and quicker than the usual drop. The rider does not linger. He waits only long enough for the bar to rise, and then urges his horse forward onto the bridge, the hooves making a deep, slow thud on the planks, a solitary, rhythmic beat that fades as he climbs the near lane and disappears over the crest. The keeper lowers the bar, drops the penny into the box, and then stands for a moment with his hand resting on the toll box lid, his gaze drifting downstream to where the river curves around a stand of willows, their pale green leaves just beginning to unfurl in the early spring warmth. The afternoon wears on in this slow, gentle way, each toll blending into the next, each coin adding its small, definite weight to the store inside the box. You notice that the keeper recognizes most of the returning travelers by the set of their shoulders or the shape of their carts, and he greets some with a nod, others with a word about the weather or the roads, and a few with no more than the quiet, efficient transaction of coin and bar. There is a rhythm to it that feels as old and established as the river itself, a pattern that has been repeated on this bridge for so long that it has ceased to be a series of individual events, and become instead a single, continuous act, a slow, gentle sentence that stretches across the hours and the seasons without pause. Late in the afternoon, when the shadows of the alders have begun to stretch long and thin across the meadow on the far bank, a final cart appears, driven by a young man with a tired face and a coat that is too large for him, probably his father's. The cart is empty except for a small folded piece of paper that he carries in his pocket, a receipt for the sale of a pig, and he pays his penny with a hand that trembles slightly from exhaustion or relief. He offers no words beyond a mumbled greeting, and the keeper accepts the coin with the same calm, steady hand that has accepted all the others. The bar lifts for the last time that afternoon, and the cart rolls across, its wheels making a hollow, echoing sound on the planks, and then the lane is empty once more. The far hedgerow still, the distant fields settling into the quiet of the approaching evening. The keeper walks back to the hut, his pace unchanged, and he pauses at the door to look once more at the river, which has taken on the first amber tints of the lowering sun, the water now a deep golden brown where it runs over the gravel shallows and a darker glossy green in the lee of the piers. The mallards have drifted off, the swans are nowhere to be seen, and the only sound is the river's voice, that steady, endless hush that asks nothing and gives nothing except its own quiet, abiding presence. You remain at the door, watching the last light play across the water, and you feel the day's slow, gentle rhythm settle into your bones like a long, familiar melody that you will carry with you into the night. As the sun drops behind the wooded ridge on the western bank, the whole valley slips into a soft amber half-light that turns the river into a broad ribbon of pewter flowing between darkening banks. You stand near the toll bar, your hands resting lightly on the damp wood, and you watch the slow, steady transformation of the sky from pale grey to a wash of deep gold and rose that seems to rise from the horizon like watercolour bleeding into wet paper. The keeper has been inside the hut for a short while, tending to the fire, and you can see the faint orange glow of the hearth through the doorway, pulsing gently as the peat settles. The day's last light catches the stone piers of the bridge, warming their grey surfaces to a soft, honeyed tone, and for a few minutes every edge in the landscape is sharp and clear, the alders on the far bank etched in fine, dark lines against the luminous sky. The keeper emerges from the hut with a tallow candle in one hand, its flame already lit and steady despite the faint breeze that stirs along the river. He cups his other hand around it as he walks, protecting the small yellow tongue of fire from any sudden gust, and you observe how carefully he moves, as if the candle were a living thing that required a gentle, patient escort. He reaches the window, the same square of oiled linen through which the morning light had seeped hours ago, and he sets the candle on the deep stone sill, pushing it back until it rests securely against the frame. From outside, the effect is immediate and quiet, a small, warm point of light that blows through the linen and casts a faint, diffuse rectangle onto the lane and the near end of the bridge. It is a silent signal to any late traveller that the bridge remains tended, that the toll bar has not been abandoned to the night, and it will burn there, slowly diminishing until the keeper blows it out before sleep. The light from the candle joins the fading amber of the sky, and for a brief, suspended interval the whole world seems to hold its breath between day and night. The river, which has taken on the metallic sheen of pewter, slides beneath the bridge with its eternal patient murmur, and the sound seems to deepen as the light fades, the hush of the water growing richer and more resonant, now that the birds have fallen silent. A single bat flitters out from under the eaves of the hut, its flight a quick, erratic scribble against the glowing sky, and then it vanishes over the rushes. The keeper stands beside the window, his profile outlined by the candle's glow, and he looks toward the empty lane that climbs the hill into the gathering dusk, his expression as calm and unexpectant as it has been all day. A long quiet stretch passes in which nothing moves on either bank except the slow drift of the river and the gradual imperceptible deepening of the shadows. You find yourself leaning against the rough stone of the bridge railing, the cold of the rock seeping through your coat, and you listen to the water and watch the colors fade from the sky. The amber gives way to a soft bruised violet, and the violet deepens into a blue-gray that seems to rise from the earth itself, swallowing the outlines of the distant hills and the far meadow. The first star appears above the eastern ridge, a single steady point of silver that trembles slightly in the cooling air, and then another appears, and another, until the whole arc of the sky is dusted with faint, scattered lights. It is in this deepening twilight that a sound begins to separate itself from the murmur of the river, a sound that is at first so faint you mistake it for the rustle of a night bird in the reeds. But it grows and it resolves into the slow, uneven clop of a single cow's hooves on packed earth, accompanied by the soft, irregular clank of a bell. The keeper turns his head toward the lane, his body still otherwise, and he waits, just as he has waited all day for every traveller, with the patience of stone. The cow appears a few moments later, a dark, heavy shape moving out of the gloom, her head low and her gait slow and tired. Behind her walks a farmer, his figure barely more than a silhouette against the last pale glow of the western sky, his coat collar turned up and his stick dragging lightly along the ground. They approach the toll bar, and the cow stops without being told, her broad, gentle face turned toward the candlelight that spills from the hut window. Her breast plumes in the cooling air, a soft white cloud that catches the light and dissipates, and the bell around her neck clanks once more, a deep, hollow note that seems to hang in the quiet before fading. The farmer steps forward, his face now half illuminated by the candle, and you see that he is an older man, his cheeks lined and his eyes tired. the weight of a long day's search written into the slope of his shoulders. He does not speak, because the hour is too far gone for talk. He simply reaches into his coat and draws out a single penny, the coin catching the light for a brief moment as he holds it out to the keeper. The keeper accepts it with a nod of understanding, the kind of nod that acknowledges not just the payment, but the weariness behind it. And he drops the penny into the toll box with a soft, solitary chink that sounds louder in the quiet dusk than it did at noon. The bar lifts with its familiar groan, and the farmer urges the cow forward onto the bridge with a low, wordless sound. The cow steps onto the planks with a heavy, slow tread, her hooves making deep, hollow thuds that echo off the water, and the bell clanks once, twice, and then fades as she reaches the middle of the bridge. You watch her dark shape move across, the farmer following with his stick still dragging, and then they reach the far bank and begin the climb up the lane toward the crest. The sound of the bell comes one last time, faint and distant, like a small tired voice saying good night, and then it is gone, swallowed by the darkness and the quiet. The keeper lowers the toll bar for the final time that day, the counterweight settling with a solid final sound that seems to mark the end of something, though you cannot say exactly what. He stands for a moment with his hand on the wood, looking up at the sky where the stars are now bright and numerous, and then he turns and walks back toward the hut. You follow, feeling the cool night air settle around you like a cloak, and you pause at the threshold while the keeper moves inside to the hearth, where the fire has burned down to a deep, steady glow that fills the small room with a gentle, encompassing warmth. The keeper takes a wooden box from the shelf, a simple, sturdy box with a hinged lid and a small iron lock that he opens with a key from his belt, and he sets it on the deal table under the candle's steady flame. Then he walks back outside, and you watch him approach the toll box fixed to the post beside the bar. He lifts the box from its bracket with both hands, the weight of the day's coins making it heavier than it was at dawn, and he carries it back inside, setting it on the flagstone beside the table. The lid of the toll box has no lock, only a simple wooden latch that he lifts with his thumb, and when he opens it, the candlelight falls on a small, dull mound of copper pennies and halfpennies and halfpennies and farthings, their surfaces catching the light in tiny, scattered gleams. He empties the day's collection into a canvas bag, tilting the toll box carefully so that the coins slide out in a slow, metallic rush, filling the bag with a soft, chinking weight. The bag is old, its fabric worn thin and stained dark in places, and its drawstring has been knotted and re-knotted many times. Once the toll box is empty, he sets it aside and pulls the drawstring tight, then lifts the bag onto the table, where the coins inside settle with a muted clatter. The keeper draws up the three-legged stool and sits, the wood creaking under him with that familiar, low note, and he loosens the drawstring and pours the coins out onto the tabletop in a broad, shallow pile. He begins to count, separating the pennies from the halfpennies and farthings with slow, deliberate movements of his fingers. The pennies he stacks in small towers of 6, each stack representing sixpence, and the halfpennies and farthings he groups in neat, separate piles to one side. His lips move slightly as he counts, the numbers form silently, and you watch his fingers work with the same unhurried, methodical precision that he applies to every task. The candlelight flickers against the copper, making the coins gleam softly, and the only sounds are the gentle click of coin against coin, and the steady murmur of the river through the thin walls. He counts 5 stacks of 6 pennies, 30 pence in total, and then a loose group of 4 more pennies, bringing the sum to 34. The small change he tallies next, 2 halfpennies and 8 farthings, which together make another 2 pence, and then a single extra farthing, so that the final sum is 36 pence and 1 farthing, or 3 shillings and a farthing. It is a wholly ordinary sum, neither notably high nor notably low, and the keeper regards it with the same quiet, unsurprised attention he would give to any other number. He writes the figure on a small slip of scrap paper, the quills scratching softly, and then he blots the ink with the felt and sets the slip aside for later entry into the ledger. For a long moment he simply sits at the table, his hands resting loosely around the stacks of coins, and you see his gaze drift toward the candle, where the flame burns steady and tall, its small yellow heart unwavering. The figures have settled in his mind without excitement or disappointment, and they will join all the other figures in the ledger tomorrow morning. Just another line in the long, patient record of the bridge. At length he scoops the coins back into the canvas bag, pulling the drawstring tight, and he rises from the stool and crosses to the corner of the hut where a loose floorboard hides a small iron-bound coffer. He kneels, works the board free with the tip of his knife, and lifts the coffer's heavy lid. Inside, a larger canvas bag already rests, half full with the previous day's collections, and he places the new bag beside it, the coins settling with a soft, muffled weight. The coffer closes, the floorboard is nudged back into place, and the keeper rises, brushing the dust from his knees with the same motion he performed yesterday and will perform tomorrow. The room is now fully dark except for the candle on the windowsill and the low orange glow of the embers in the hearth. The keeper takes the candle from the window, shielding its flame with his hand, and he carries it to the table, where he sets it on a small iron dish that serves as a permanent holder. The light pools on the tabletop, illuminating the closed ledger, the inkwell, the quill, and the scrap of paper with the day's total written on it, all arranged in the same neat order they have occupied for years. He does not open the ledger tonight. That will wait for the morning, when the light is better and the day's first crossing has been completed and recorded in its proper sequence. Instead, he stands at the table and looks at the small, orderly arrangement of objects, and you sense that he is satisfied in a way that does not require expression. A quiet, wordless contentment that comes from the completion of a simple, familiar task. Outside, the night has fully settled, and the river continues its endless, patient murmur under the bridge, a sound that seems to grow louder in the darkness, or perhaps you simply notice it more, now that every other sound has faded. The keeper walks to the door, which he had left ajar, and he pushes it open to look out one last time. You join him there, standing in the doorway, and you see the valley transformed by moonlight, the river a faint silver ribbon winding between the dark shapes of the hills, the bridge a low black silhouette against the starry sky. A thin mist has begun to rise from the water again, just as it did at dawn, and it coils upward in slow, silent ribbons that catch the moonlight and turn it into something soft and ghostly. The toll bar stands dark and still at the end of the bridge, its iron counterweight a small, dense shape against the pale ground, and the lane is empty, a faint, pale line that climbs the hill and disappears into the darkness. The keeper stands in the doorway for a long, quiet while, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, and he breathes the cool, damp air that carries the scent of wet earth, moss, and the distant, faint sweetness of some night-blooming flower you cannot name. His breathing is slow and even, and you find your own breath falling into the same rhythm, the boundary between your stillness and his blurring in the quiet. At last he sighs, a soft, almost inaudible exhale that is not weariness but acceptance, and he steps back inside, closing the door to a narrow gap that admits only a sliver of moonlight and the sound of the river. He moves about the hut in the dim golden light of the candle, preparing for sleep with the same unhurried, methodical rhythm that has marked every action of the day. He checks the fire, adding a final block of peat that will smoulder through the night and hold the warmth until morning, and he fills the kettle from the water jug and sets it on the flagstone, ready for the first cup of tea at dawn. The candle he will leave burning a little longer, he decides, because there is no need to hurry the dark, and he sits on the edge of his cot and removes his boots one at a time, his fingers working the damp leather laces with a patience that seems inexhaustible. The cot creaks under his weight as he settles back, his head finding the shallow, straw-filled pillow, and he folds his hands across his stomach and closes his eyes, not to sleep immediately, but to listen for a while to the river's voice, which tells him nothing he does not already know and promises nothing different for the morning ahead. You remain for a time in the quiet hut, watching the candle burn down and the shadows dance on the lime-washed walls, and you feel the deep, slow peace of this place settle over you one final time as the evening toll fades into the memory of the day. The river murmurs on, indifferent to the hour, and the bridge stands empty and still under the stars, as it will stand until the mist rises at dawn, and the first hoof-fall sounds on the lane, and the keeper rises to begin the same quiet story again, a story as old as the river and as patient as the stone piers that hold the bridge above the water. when full darkness comes and the last trace of amber has drained from the sky, the keeper rises from the edge of his cot where he had been sitting in the quiet, his boots still on, his hands resting loosely in his lap. The candle on the table has burned down by a thumb's width, its flame steady and tall in the still air of the hut, and it casts a small golden pool of light that reaches the hearth and the shelf and the closed ledger, but does not quite touch the corners of the room. You are still there, near the door, and you watch him take up the horn lantern that hangs from a peg beside the chimney breast. Its sides made of thin, translucent panels of polished horn stitched together with leather, its iron base rust-spotted but solid. He opens the small door of the lantern with a careful, practiced motion, and from the candle on the table he lights a fresh, tallow wick inside, the flame catching at once and glowing through the horn with a warm, buttery yellow light that seems softer and more diffuse than the candle's flame. He closes the little door, the latch clicking shut with a small, definite sound, and the lantern sways gently as he lifts it by its ring handle, the light swinging in a slow, lazy arc across the lime-washed walls and the rafters. He carries the lantern to the door, his other hand reaching for the heavy woolen coat that still hangs on its peg, still carrying the faint, clean scent of rain from the afternoon, and he pulls it over his shoulders without hurry, the sleeves settling into place with a soft, familiar weight. You step aside as he pushes the door fully open, and the wash of cool, damp air enters the hut, stirring the fire smoke and carrying with it the deep, earthy smell of the river at night, a smell that is both clean and ancient, like wet stone and dark mud, and the faint green breath of water weeds. He walks out into the darkness, and you follow, the lantern's glow bobbing ahead of you and casting a shifting golden circle on the wet grass, while beyond that circle the night presses in, vast and quiet and full of stars. The first thing he does is walk to the toll bar, the lantern held at waist height so that its light catches the outline of the wood and the dark, solid shape of the iron counterweight. He checks that the bar is fully lowered into its slot, his free hand running along the top edge with that same absent, checking motion you have seen so many times today, feeling for any splinters or wetness or looseness that might need attention. The wood is cool and damp under his palm, but it is sound, the grain smooth and unbroken, and the fastening at the near post is secure, the rope tight, and the knot firm. He tugs once on the bar, a gentle, testing pull, and it holds steady, just as it has held steady every night for more years than he can count. The iron hinge gives a soft, almost inaudible creak as the bar settles back into place, and then it is still. From the toll bar he walks to the top of the stone steps that lead down to the small landing below the bridge, the lantern's light spilling over the edge and catching the dark, glossy surface of the water as it slides past the pier. He descends the steps slowly, his boots making a soft, scraping sound on the worn stone, and you remain at the top, watching the circle of yellow light descend until it reaches the water's edge. There he kneels, setting the lantern on the flat stone beside him, and he takes hold of the rope that secures the rowing boat, the same rope he spliced earlier in the afternoon. He pulls on it gently, feeling the resistance of the boat as it tugs against the tether, and then he checks the splice with his fingers, tracing the smooth, tapered join where the new hemp has been tucked into the old. The splice holds firm, the fibers tight and even, and the knot at the iron ring is dry and secure. He gives the rope one final gentle tug, and the boat bobs softly on the dark water, its tarred hull gleaming faintly in the lantern light, and then he rises, his knees creaking, and climbs back up the steps. Now he walks onto the bridge itself, the planks sounding hollow and deep under his boots, and the lantern light spreads out around him in a soft golden pool that catches the wood grain and the faint, silvery traces of dried mud left by the day's hooves. He pauses at the midpoint of the bridge, where the span is longest and the water runs deepest, and he sets the lantern on the railing, its light falling across the river in a long, wavering ribbon of gold that seems to float on the surface. You join him there, your hands resting on the cool stone of the railing, and you look down at the water together. The river runs black and patient under the bridge, its surface smooth except for the faint shifting swirls where the current presses against the piers, and the lantern light catches these swirls and turns them into small fleeting whorls of gold that appear and vanish and appear again. The water's voice is deeper at night, a low, steady hush that seems to rise from the very center of the earth, and it fills the darkness with a sound that is both constant and ever-changing, a sound that asks nothing and offers nothing except its own quiet, abiding presence. Above you the sky is clear and crowded with stars, the same stars that have shone on this valley for 1,000 nights, and their light falls on the river in a faint silver dusting that the lantern's gold cannot quite reach. You can see the reflection of a few early bright stars as small trembling points of light on the water's surface, and they shift and waver with the current. Never still, never the same from one moment to the next. The keeper lifts his gaze to the heavens, and he stands there for a long quiet, while, his face lit from below by the lantern, his expression calm and unreadable, his breathing slow and even. He is not thinking of anything in particular, you sense, or if he is, his thoughts are as slow and drifting as the water below, moving without destination, content to flow. The night air smells of damp earth and wood smoke and the faint cold scent of the river, and there is a chill in it now, a sharpness that speaks of the hour and the season and the long slow turning of the earth toward morning. A soft breeze stirs the rushes on the bank below the hut, and they rustle with a dry, papery sound that rises and falls and then dies away, leaving only the river's voice again. Far off, somewhere up the valley, an owl calls, a single low hoot that hangs in the quiet for a long moment before fading, and then another owl answers from the far woods, its call fainter and higher, and then there is silence again, except for the water. The keeper listens, his head tilted slightly, and you listen too, and the calls of the owls settle into the night like stones dropping into a deep, still pond, their ripples spreading outward and vanishing. After a time, the keeper picks up the lantern, his fingers curling around the ring handle with the same easy, familiar grip, and he turns away from the railing and walks slowly back toward the near bank. His boots make a steady, hollow rhythm on the planks, a sound that seems to measure the quiet rather than break it, and you follow, your own footsteps softer and lighter. He pauses at the end of the bridge to look back one more time, the lantern held aloft so that its light falls across the whole length of the span, and you see the dark timbers gleaming faintly, the toll bar a low solid shape at the far end, the water sliding past beneath, constant and unchanging. Then he turns and walks the short distance to the hut, the circle of light moving with him, and you feel the night close in behind you, soft and cool and patient. Inside the hut, the fire has burned down to a deep, steady heart of orange embers that glows softly in the darkness, and the keeper sets the lantern on the table, its light joining the candle's fading flame to fill the small room with a warm golden glow. He closes the door, not all the way at first, but enough to keep out the chill while still admitting a narrow slice of night air, and then he slides the wooden bar across, a simple heavy beam that drops into iron brackets on either side of the doorframe, securing the hut for the night. The sound of the bar dropping into place is a low, solid thunk, a final, definitive sound that marks the end of the day's small labors and the beginning of a long, quiet stretch until dawn. He turns to the hearth, where the embers pulse and fade with a slow, sleepy rhythm, and he adds a single log from the small stack beside the chimney, a thick, dark piece of oak that has been drying for a year and more. He places it carefully on the bed of embers, adjusting its position with the iron poker until it sits securely, and then he watches for a moment as the embers lick at the dry wood, small tongues of blue and orange flame beginning to curl around the bark. The log will burn slowly through the night, giving off a steady, gentle warmth that will keep the chill at bay until morning, and the keeper nods once, satisfied, before setting the poker aside and straightening up. The candle on the table has burned very low now, its flame a small, wavering teardrop of light that flutters in the faint draught from the door, and he pinches it out between his thumb and forefinger, a quick, practiced motion that leaves a thin trail of smoke curling upward into the darkness. The lantern he leaves burning a little longer, its softer, warmer glow filling the room, and by its light he moves about the hut in the slow, unhurried way of someone preparing for rest. He fills the kettle from the water jug and sets it on the flagstone near the hearth, ready for the morning, and he checks that the ledger is closed and the inkwell corked and the quill laid straight. All these small actions flow together into a single seamless ritual that has been repeated so many times it has become as natural as breathing, and you watch him with a quiet, drowsy attention, your own thoughts beginning to slow and settle. At last he sits on the edge of his cot, the straw mattress rustling under his weight, and he begins to remove his boots. The laces are damp and a little stiff from the evening dew, and he works at them with patient fingers, loosening the knots and drawing the leather thongs through the eyelets one by one. The first boot comes off with a soft, sucking sound, and he sets it on the floor beside the cot, its toe pointing toward the hearth. The second boot follows, and he places it neatly beside the first, the two of them standing side by side like a pair of tired companions. He flexes his toes inside his woolen stockings, feeling the warmth of the fire on his feet, and then he swings his legs up onto the cot and settles back against the straw-filled pillow, his coat still draped over his shoulders like a blanket. He lies there for a while without closing his eyes, listening to the river's voice through the wattle and daub of the walls, a sound that has asked nothing of him for many years and promises nothing different for the morning ahead. The lantern on the table burns on, its golden light casting soft, shifting shadows on the rafters, and the log in the hearth settles with a quiet, comfortable crackle, sending a brief shower of sparks up the chimney. You remain standing near the door, reluctant to break the stillness, and you feel the deep, slow peace of the night wrap around you like a heavy, warm quilt, pressing gently on your shoulders and your eyelids. The keeper's breathing grows slower and more regular, his chest rising and falling in a steady, measured rhythm. And though he is not yet asleep, he is somewhere very close to it, drifting in that soft, borderless place where thoughts lose their edges and blur into the quiet. The river murmurs on, its voice the last sound in the world, and the stars wheel slowly overhead, indifferent and eternal, while the little hut by the bridge holds its small pocket of warmth and light against the vast, cool darkness of the valley. The toll bar stands lowered and secure, the rope holds the boat steady, and the ledger waits on the shelf, its pages ready for another day's quiet record. All is as it should be, as it has been, as it will be when the mist rises again at dawn, and the first hoof-fall sounds on the lane, and the keeper rises from his cot to begin the same slow, gentle story once more. Spring leaks into summer, and summer fades into autumn, while the keeper's routine remains as constant as the stone piers that hold the bridge, and you remain there too, a quiet witness to the slow, circular breath of the valley. The days pass not in a line, but in a gentle repeating curve that brings the same tasks at the same hour, the same sounds across the water, the same small pile of copper coins in the toll box at evening, and yet within that sameness, the world outside the hut undergoes its ancient, unhurried transformation. You notice it first in the color of the light, which shifts from the pale, watery gold of early spring to a deeper, richer amber by high summer, and then to a soft, slanting bronze in autumn, before thinning to the cold, clear silver of winter. Each change so gradual that you cannot say exactly when it happened, only that it has. In March the river rises with the snowmelt from the Welsh hills, and you watch the water turn from its winter green to a thick, churning brown heavy with silt and the cold, clean taste of melted ice. The current runs faster, pressing against the stone piers with a deeper, more insistent voice, and it carries with it all manner of things that are being frozen or buried through the colder months, broken branches, clumps of last year's reeds, and once a whole small tree that had been undercut by the thaw and now spins slowly in the eddies before being swept downstream. The keeper walks to the bridge each morning and looks over the railing of the water, noting its height against the marks on the stone pier, a series of faint, weathered lines that someone long ago scratched into the rock to measure the floods. The water is high, but not dangerously so, lapping at a point halfway up the lowest mark, and he nods once, satisfied, before returning to the hut to put the kettle on. The toll bar still lifts for the same drovers and the same flocks, but now the sheep are accompanied by lambs, small, long-legged creatures that skitter on new legs and press close to their mother's flanks, their bleats high and thin and constant. The farmers pay the same toll, 1 penny for every 2 sheep, and the coins drop into the box with the same small, definite chink. But the air round the transaction is different now, filled with the soft, urgent sounds of new life and the smell of wet wool drying in the weak spring sun. The keeper records each crossing in his ledger, the quill moving across the page in its neat, unhurried strokes, and beside the entries he sometimes notes the number of lambs, a small addition that changes nothing but pleases some quiet part of him. By April the hedgerows have begun to green, their bare winter branches swelling with buds that open into the pale, delicate leaves of hawthorn and blackthorn, and the air carries the faint, sweet scent of the first wild garlic that grows in damp patches along the lane. The mist still rises from the river at dawn, but it is thinner now, and dissipates more quickly, burned off by a sun that climbs higher each day and stays longer in the sky. The keeper props the door open earlier in the mornings and leaves it open later in the evenings, and the fire in the hearth burns lower, a small steady glow rather than the deep, roaring warmth of winter. You find yourself spending more time outside, leaning against the sun-warmed stone of the bridge railing, watching the swallows arrive from the south and begin their swift acrobatic flights over the water, their backs a glossy blue-black that flashes in the light. May brings a stretch of warm, still days when the river settles back into its summer green and the meadows on both banks grow tall, with grass and the first yellow flowers of the year. The traffic on the bridge increases slightly, not in any dramatic way, but in the quiet, steady manner of a season shifting into its fuller self, and the keeper lifts the toll bar for carts loaded with seed and tools, and the occasional drove of young cattle being moved to summer pasture. The cattle are smaller and livelier than the great, slow Herefords of the autumn market, and they cross the bridge with a quick, restless energy, their hooves making a lighter, faster clatter on the planks, their lowing higher and more frequent. The keeper counts them carefully, his lips moving, and the drovers pay their pennies and move on, the sound of the herd fading into the warm, humming stillness of the afternoon. By June the grass along the banks has grown tall and pale green, and when the wind stirs it, it moves in soft, silvery waves that ripple from the water's edge to the foot of the hills. The keeper opens the toll bar in his shirt sleeves now, his woolen coat hung on its peg inside the hut, and the sun is warm on his forearms, a pleasant, steady warmth that soaks into his skin and loosens the small, tight muscles of his shoulders. You watch him stand at the bar, his face tilted toward the sun, his eyes half closed, and you feel the same warmth on your own skin, a gentle, drowsy heat that slows your thoughts and blends the hours together into a single golden stretch of contentment. The river murmurs on, its voice softer in the summer, a low, liquid whisper that seems to carry the scent of water mint and the distant, sweet song of a blackbird. The longest day comes and goes almost unnoticed, marked only by the keeper's observation that the sun now sets far to the north of the western ridge, and that the twilight lingers well past the hour he usually lights the candle. He still sets the candle on the windowsill at dusk, a small unnecessary flame in the long pale evening, but it is a habit he does not think to break, and so it burns there, a tiny point of yellow against the lingering rose and lavender of the sky. The toll box fills with its ordinary sums, and the ledger fills with its neat columns, and the river slides past the piers with its eternal, patient murmur, indifferent to the turning of the solstice. July brings a stretch of hot, still weather that hushes the valley into a deep, drowsy quiet. The air grows thick and heavy, smelling of dry grass and warm mud, and the faint, dusty scent of the lane. And the keeper moves more slowly than usual, his pace reduced to a lazy, ambling walk that matches the slow drift of the clouds overhead. He takes to sitting in the doorway in the late afternoon, a cup of cool water from the jug in his hand, and he watches the dragonflies patrol the rushes with their quick, darting flights, their wings catching the sun and turning it into tiny, scattered rainbows. The sheep that cross the bridge are panting, their mouths open and their fleeces dusty, and the drovers pause at the toll bar to exchange a few words about the heat and the water level and the likelihood of rain, conversations that drift and fade without resolution, leaving only the quiet of the afternoon behind them. When August arrives, the grass on the meadows begins to brown at the tips, and the river shrinks back from its banks, exposing a narrow rim of cracked grey mud along the water's edge. The toll-keeper notes the lower water level with the same calm, unsurprised attention he gives to everything, and he adjusts the rope on the rowing boat by a few inches so that the boat sits comfortably in the shallower water, its hull just barely brushing the stones at the landing. The swans that had nested upstream have returned with their cygnets, now half-grown and a soft, sooty grey. and they drift past the bridge in a slow, regal procession, the young birds sticking close to their parents, their necks still straight and uncurved. The keeper watches them pass with a quiet, steady gaze, and you watch with him, feeling the slow, heavy weight of the summer settle around you like a warm, comforting blanket. September comes with a shift in the air, a faint, cool sharpness in the mornings that speaks of autumn, even while the afternoons remain warm and golden. The keeper, who has worked in his shirt sleeves for 3 months, returns his woolen coat to his shoulders when he rises, its weight a familiar, reassuring presence after the bare-armed freedom of summer. The mist rises thicker from the river at dawn, a soft, white blanket that covers the water in the meadows and the lower slopes of the hills, and it takes longer to burn off, sometimes lingering until mid-morning in the shaded hollows along the bank. The traffic on the bridge begins to change in character. The carts now carrying not seed and tools, but the first of the harvest. Sacks of barley and wheat, and the pale, dusty smell of threshed grain that sifts into the air as the carts rumble past. By October, the trees along the far bank have turned, the alders dropping their leaves in slow, spiraling showers of yellow and brown. The oaks on the upper slopes holding their bronze and russet foliage for a few weeks longer before releasing it to the wind. The air carries the smell of wet leaves and the faint, sharp tang of wood smoke from the keeper's hearth, a smell that grows stronger as the days shorten and the fire in the hut burns longer and higher. The pennies feel colder when they drop into the keeper's palm, the copper chilled by the morning air and the damp, and he cups his hands around them for a moment before dropping them into the toll box, as if to lend them a little warmth. The farmers who cross the bridge are wrapped in their heavy coats, their breath pluming in the cold air, and they stamp their boots while they wait for the bar to lift. A rhythm of small, impatient sounds that has no real urgency behind it. November brings the first hard frosts, and you wake one morning to find the grass along the bank white and stiff, each blade coated in a fine crystalline fur that crunches softly underfoot. The toll bar is rimed with frost, a thin silver edge that melts slowly as the weak sun climbs above the ridge, and the iron counterweight is so cold that it burns the keeper's fingers when he touches it. A quick, sharp bite that fades as soon as he tucks his hand into his pocket. The river runs slower now, its surface a dark, glossy grey, and the mist that rises from it is thicker and colder, a damp, clinging vapour that seeps through the keeper's coat and settles in his bones. He spends more time inside the hut during these days, the door closed against the chill, the fire a steady, orange heart that fills the small room with warmth and the hiss of burning peat, and he writes in his ledger by the light of the candle, the quill moving across the page in its same neat strokes, the ink thick and slow in the cold. December arrives with a quiet grey stillness that seems to muffle the whole valley. The days are short, the sun a pale, watery disk that barely clears the ridge before beginning its slow descent, and the long nights are filled with the deep, steady murmur of the river, a sound that seems to grow louder and closer in the dark. A thin coat of ice forms along the edges of the river, where the water runs slowest. A delicate, glassy crust that cracks and tinkles as the current shifts beneath it, and the keeper spends a part of each morning breaking the ice from around the boat with a long pole, his breath billowing in white clouds. The swans have gone downstream to warmer waters, and the swallows are long departed, leaving the valley to the crows and the owls and the small brown wrens that flit through the bare hedgerows with a nervous, constant energy. The tolls continue through the winter, though they are fewer and farther between, the traffic reduced to the essential, the necessary, the unavoidable. A farmer drives a single pig to the market at Monmouth, the animal's bristly hide steaming in the cold, and he pays his penny with a hand reddened and cracked from the weather. A cart loaded with firewood crosses the bridge, the logs stacked high and bound with chains, and the driver, a man the keeper knows by sight but not by name, calls a greeting that is carried away by the wind before it can be answered. The keeper records each crossing in the ledger, his handwriting unchanged by the season, the ink sometimes smudging where his cold fingers have brushed the page, but the entries are as neat and as steady as they were in June. A record of small events in a small place that asks nothing more of the world than what it already gives. January brings a deeper cold, a cold that settles into the stone of the bridge and the earth of the banks and the thatch of the hut, and the keeper builds his fire higher and burns his candles longer. The small golden flames a bulwark against the long, dark hours. The river is low now, its winter level a bare thin flow between exposed stones that are covered in a slippery green film of algae, and the sound of the water is quieter, a thin, reedy whisper, rather than the full, deep hush of spring. You stand with the keeper on the bridge one morning as a light, dry snow begins to fall, the flakes small and sparse, drifting down from a pale grey sky to settle on the dark wood of the toll bar and melt almost at once. He holds out his palm to catch a few flakes, watching them dissolve into tiny drops of water, and then he tucks his hand back into his coat and turns toward the hut, his boots leaving dark prints on the snow-dusted planks. And then, almost without you noticing, the year has turned. The snow stops, the ice melts, and the first faint green of new growth appears in the sheltered hollows along the lane, a colour so pale and tender that you might miss it if you did not know to look. The keeper knows to look. He has seen this green appear and fade and appear again for many years, and he pauses on his morning walk to the bridge to study a small patch of it growing at the base of the alder, its tiny leaves uncurling toward the weak, watery light. The river begins to rise again with the first snow melt from the distant hills, its voice deepening and strengthening as the current picks up speed, and the mist returns to the water at dawn, a soft, familiar companion that wraps the bridge and the hut and the keeper in its quiet, white embrace. None of this feels like change to the keeper, not really. It is simply the slow circular breath of a place that has no need of haste, the turning of a wheel so large and so gentle that its motion is almost imperceptible. The same farmers cross the bridge with the same flocks, their lambs skittering on new legs just as they did a year ago, and the same coins drop into the same box with the same small, definite sounds. The ledger fills with its columns of names and numbers, the handwriting steady and unchanged, and the rope on the boat is checked and spliced when it frays, and the fire burns on through the evenings, and the candle glows on the windowsill, a small steady beacon in the long quiet nights. The river continues its endless patient murmur under the bridge, a sound that has lasted longer than any keeper and will last longer than any keeper to come, and it asks nothing of the world except to be allowed to flow. And as the keeper closes the ledger for the final entry of the year and trims the candle for the night and settles onto his cot with the familiar creaking sigh of the straw mattress, the sound of the river rises once more to meet the dark, a timeless and unvarying companion that is already waiting to begin the same quiet story again when morning returns. You stand in the doorway for a final moment, looking out at the bridge and the water and the pale scattered stars, and you feel the deep, slow peace of this place settle into you one last time, a peace that has no beginning and no end, only the gentle, unhurried turning of a year by the bridge.